하지만 딸, 잘 생각해봐. 파도는 바람이 끌어당겨줘서 모래성을 만들었어. 그리고 이제는 바람이 미는 대로 모래성을 부수는 것뿐이야. 그러니까 파도는 슬플 필요가 없는 거지.
Another way I like to look at Rien's quote here is embracing how futile the waves are with respect to the sea as a whole. Sure, this wave knocked down the sandcastle because it was spurred on by the wind, but will this interaction change the seas as a whole? Will the waves push back against the greater ebb and flow of the sea? No, the wave that toppled the castle is utterly insignificant. But since you're watching the MSE3210 SANGRIA version though, all the context you need to know is that Rien, the father figure of one of the game's main characters, had half his face casually ripped off by his pseudo-daughter when she left home, leaving a, quote, vicious burn across his face, which, in-game, is shown as a wound where half of the skin of his face is just kind of gone, exposing raw facial muscle underneath. To remedy this, Rien has his notorious porcelain mask, with which he covers his burn wounds most of the time. The porcelain mask has some sort of colorization feature and high temperature associated with it, as in the game when he presses his mask down onto the wound, there is a sizzling sound, and we can see steam exiting the mask. This implies that the mask must be very high temperature, enough to cauterize the bleeding from the wound on his face in a short amount of time. So how hot is Rien's mask really? And how do we model this as engineers? Well, like the fertility of the waves, we can use the semi-infinite solid model approximation. The semi-infinite solid model makes the overarching assumption that the application of heat on one side of the solid will have no impact on the other side of the solid. Applying this to Rien, the heat of Rien's mask needs to be applied quick enough and shallow enough to only impact the surface of his face, where the wound is, and not melt his brain further past the wound. Using pork belly as a substitute for human facial muscle and a porcelain plate to mimic Rien's mask, we can both validate the use of the semi-infinite solid method and find our own alpha by mimicking Rien's mask cauterization experimentally. From there, we can use this experimental alpha in tandem with the realistic temperature values and times from the game to calculate how hot Rien's mask should be for effective cauterization. With the framework of the experiment in order, let's introduce the star equation associated with the semi-infinite solid method. This thing here. Now, for the sake of time, and because I assume you already know what all these terms are, I'm going to not explain any of the terms, instead go into my experiment and what assumptions I use, what boundary conditions I use, and at the same time I'll be showing it on this side of the screen, right here. The goal of the experiment is to mimic Rien's mask, searing his wound by using a hot plate from my lab to heat up a porcelain plate, then sear multiple pieces of pork belly on the heated porcelain plate for a set amount of time for each trial. In that way, the porcelain plate acts like Rien's mask, and the pork belly is his wounded face. To be more specific, 4 pieces of pork belly are going to be pressed onto the plate, meat side down, for 1 minute each. After the 1 minute has elapsed, the pork belly will be taken off the plate and cut open to reveal its inner cross section. There, we will measure the lengths of the browning of the meat as our thermal depth. We can use various assumptions and set experimental values to fill in all of our values for the semi-infinite solid model, except for alpha, so we can back calculate for it. First, TS, or T-surface, will be the temperature of the porcelain plate, which is subsequently determined by the temperature of the hot plate, which I set to a reasonable 350 degrees C as to not risk thermal shock when I add the room temp pork belly on it, and the plate might just straight up shatter if it's that hot. This temperature mimics the temperature of Rien's mask. Our T initial is the initial temperature of Rien's wound, or the pork belly in this case, which is about room temperature, let's say 20 degrees C. The literal bread and butter of our equation, however, is the temperature at a specific depth and time. Since I don't really have access to a thermocouple or a thermometer or anything, we'll have to use a preset temperature for this value. In this case, we'll use the Maillard reaction temperature, which is very prevalent in cooking. For context, Maillard reaction is the phenomenon of meat starting to brown because proteins and sugars are interacting with each other at elevated temperatures. Now, don't ask me to get too specific with it because MSc stands for material science and not meat science. Thankfully, the Maillard reaction happens at pretty consistent temperatures for pork belly. About 140 degrees Celsius is what I could find online. Therefore, if we measure the length of browning on the seared surface of the pork belly, we can roughly say that the temperature there is the same as the onset temperature for the Maillard reaction. With all the temperature and time variables taken care of, we can measure the thermal penetration depths for multiple trials, take the average, back out an average experimental thermal diffusivity for pork belly, which in this case is our substitute for human facial muscle. With my MATLAB code shown on screen, I was able to get an experimental alpha of about 2.2025 10 to the negative 7 meters squared per second. Using the literature, specifically a paper called The Thermal Properties of Foods, and a provided polynomial model for alpha for proteins from that paper, I found a theoretical value of alpha for the pork belly to be 1.0662 10 to the negative 7 meters squared per second instead. Luckily, we're only off by like a factor of 2, thank God for not like a magnitude of 10 or 100 or something. Even though we're kind of off, the fact that we got the same decimal places has me pretty confident about our model, and so let's use our calculated experimental human facial muscle alpha in the semi-infinite solid model equation again, except this time we'll use realistic cauterization temperatures from the literature combined with the actual time that Rien takes to press the mask onto his face in game. I lied, by the way. Unfortunately, due to time constraints and because this is the SANGRIA version of the video, I'll have to cut out the Rien's mass temperature section, and I can show you the final results right here on the screen in my MATLAB code, but can't do much to explain it, so we'll have to move on. To wrap up this video, let's briefly discuss sources of error and assumptions that may have interfered with accuracy. Firstly, the whole millimeter reaction setup thing is simply very qualitative. It requires me to gauge millimeter lengths with my eyes and a ruler to a browning layer that could be very inconsistent depending on the manner of which I press the pork belly onto the plate. Next, assuming that Rien's wound is a constant initial temperature is honestly a big fat lie. If the mask was constantly hot, and considering the natural heat from Rien's body and blood, then his facial wound should be soaking in the radiated heat. That should make the initial temperature much warmer than room temp. This would serve to actually reduce our experimental alpha closer to the theoretical alpha. Alright, that's the end folks. I'm already pretty much over time, so this is this, that is that. Goodbye.